On August 2, 1990, the morning news on Iraqi television began with a sensation. The announcer resorted to an ecstatic ultra-patriotic speech.
O majestic Iraqi people, your Arabian crown is studded with pearls. You are a symbol of power and pride. Allah helped you to overthrow the treacherous regime of Kuwait, which was involved in the orbit of Zionism and foreign intrigue.
With such Eastern-style pompous and intricate language, Iraqis were informed that their country had invaded neighboring Kuwait. The war in the Persian Gulf began, which very soon led to an extremely cruel and painful punishment of the aggressor. How and why did this happen? Watch the video below. Hello, my name is Vladlen Mariev, and you are watching History Without Myths, where we tell the story of Ukraine's and the world's past without embellishment or falsification. Subscribe to the History Without Myths channel and click on the bell to not miss new videos. Kuwait is a small emirate on the Persian Gulf coast. The area of this state is slightly less than 18,000 square kilometers, which is less than the area of our Rivne or Volyn regions. The first emir of Kuwait was proclaimed in 1762. For a long time, the British and Ottoman empires were competing for the rule of the land. The Europeans won and established their protectorate over Kuwait in the late 19th century. At that time, the main advantage of this territory for them was its proximity to India. A desert country with only 1% of the land suitable for agriculture seemed economically unattractive. But that was until the 1930s, when oil was discovered. In 1961, Kuwait became independent. It has maintained close relations with the United Kingdom. In fact, this saved the young state, because it was immediately claimed by Iraq, whose politicians considered this richest territory to be historically theirs. In June of 1961, Iraq was determined to annex the small emirate, but a British military contingent was urgently sent to Kuwait, and the greedy neighboring country did not dare to invade. Over the next almost 3 decades, Iraq's government underwent dramatic changes. But no matter who led the country, the idea of capturing Kuwait was postponed further and further. Iraq's whims reached a new level after the fruitless but very expensive war with Iran. The economy was rapidly deteriorating, with multi-billion-dollar debts mounting, and the then dictator Saddam Hussein had more and more reasons to fear a coup. It is not known whether he had heard of the Little Victorious War or even thought that there was ever a minister of the interior of Tsarist Russia, Vyacheslav Pleve, who invented this bloody remedy for revolution, but Saddam decided to use this method. The Iraqi leadership believed that the Kuwaitis were producing too much oil and dumping it on the market. But it was not a good reason to get into a fight just because the neighbors were better at trading. They began to create a formal pretext for starting a war and launched an anti-Kuyvets propaganda campaign. On July 15, 1990, Iraqi Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz sent a lengthy memorandum to Arab League Secretary General Shadli Clibby. In particular, it said that over the past 10 years, Kuwait has pumped $2.4 billion worth of oil from the Rumaila border field. They say that this is nothing more than an act of war aimed at bringing the Iraqi economy to a state of collapse. Then Saddam personally took up the matter. He no longer just accused his neighbors of stealing Rumaila, he went further and called Kuwait an artificial state created by imperialists. How can one not be surprised? Such different dictators use the same methods.
Ukraine was formed as an artificial state. Moreover, after the Second World War, Stalin gave Ukraine a number of Polish, Hungarian, and Romanian territories. This is a historical fact.
Iraq wanted Kuwait to write off $14 billion of debt and pay compensation of $2.5 billion. But Emir Sheikh Habir al-Ahmad al-Habir al-Sabah refused. He was well aware of the balance of power and knew that he would receive support not only from Western countries, but also from Arab ones. After all, Saddam was angry and began to put pressure on many people, especially Saudi Arabia. The May summit in Baghdad, where Hussein brutally accused the leaders of the Gulf states of bowing to the West and betraying the interests of the Arabs, was indicative in this regard. The situation escalated. Iraq was amassing troops on the border with Kuwait. Hussein still responded to offers of negotiations, but it was just a game. He had already decided to fight. On the night before August 2, 1990, almost 90,000 Iraqi troops invaded Kuwait. The emirate could field less than 30,000, but its army was well armed and trained by Western instructors. Wherever possible, its army resisted. Also, in the capital's Al-Jara suburb, a battalion of chieftain tanks held off the advance of tank divisions of the Iraqi Republican Guard armed with Soviet T-72s for 2 days. The Kuwaitis claimed to have destroyed 25 enemy tanks while losing only 2 of their own. When they ran out of ammunition, they were able to withdraw to Saudi Arabia. Habir al-Sabah also managed to escape there. The enemy's plan to capture him at the very beginning of the invasion failed. The Emir's guard repelled not only a night attack by elite Iraqi special forces, but for more than 18 hours resisted the main forces that invaded the capital, El Kuwait. All in all, the invaders defeated the Emirates' army in 2 days. It took a couple more days to finish off the last pockets of resistance. Saddam's plan seemed to work. His popularity in Iraq grew rapidly. The occupied state was declared the 19th province. A free interim government was formed there, headed by Iraqi protégé Colonel Allah Hussein Ali al-Afaji al-Jaber. The UN Security Council issued Resolution 660, condemning the invasion and demanding the withdrawal of troops. The USSR, a longtime ally of Iraq, also voted in favor. But it had no effect. Hussein was convinced that he had won. Who could oppose him now? Saudi Arabia? But its army is too weak. The United States? But Saddam was convinced that American politicians were still suffering from the Vietnam defeat syndrome and would not dare to start another major war. Lawlessness reigned in the occupied territory. Iraqi soldiers were looting and killing civilians. At the same time, Hussein called on Arab countries to unite for jihad against the imperialists. But they were frightened by Saddam's blitzkrieg and did not follow him. The situation was even worse on the Western Front. U.S. President George W. Bush and British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher began to form an anti-Iraqi coalition. The first priority was to protect Saudi Arabia from invasion. After all, Saddam's threats were no longer just words. In fact, it was claiming most of the Middle East's oil, which could have caused chaos on the world market. Operation Desert Shield was launched. On August 7, the United States sent its troops to Saudi Arabia. By winter, a multinational group was deployed there. 36 countries joined the coalition directly or indirectly. And these were not only Western countries. Almost half of the Arab world, Japan and Argentina, which are very far from the Middle East, and even the USSR, opposed Saddam. This time, the UN did not limit itself to a single resolution. A number of other important documents were adopted that imposed economic sanctions on Iraq and introduced significant restrictions on sea and air transportation. And on November 29, 1990, the Security Council approved the historic Resolution No. 678, which authorized the use of force against Iraq to liberate Kuwait. Saddam, although he did not expect this course of events, was not going to retreat. He continued to call on Arab countries to jihad in vain. The efforts of international diplomacy to resolve the conflict peacefully proved to be the same. The Allies continued to gather forces. In January of 1991, they concentrated more than 700,000 personnel, 4,000 tanks, 3,700 guns and mortars for the war. In addition to the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Egypt, and Syria sent significant ground forces. The aviation component was very powerful. More than 2,000 aircraft were involved, including B-52 strategic bombers and F-117 stealth aircraft. The naval armada included nearly 200 warships and auxiliary vessels. For example, the U.S. Navy deployed 6 multi-purpose aircraft carriers, half of its ships of this class. Overall, almost 80% of the coalition forces were American. Norman Schwarzkopf led the American and European contingents. He was a 4-star American general with a wealth of experience. He fought in Vietnam, and during the invasion of Grenada in 1983, he commanded the ground forces. The general was used to defending his own opinion and did not shy away from sharp words. For this, he was not very well respected by Pentagon officials, but President Bush, a former naval aviator who fought in the Pacific in World War II, highly regarded General Schwarzkopf and trusted him completely. Given the balance of power in the coalition, it was the Americans who had the leading role in leading the operation. But Schwarzkopf was not the sole commander. The forces of Arab and Muslim countries were subordinated to a Saudi general with the simple name Khalid bin Sultan bin Abdulaziz al Saud. Iraq had the 5th largest army in the world. On the ground, Saddam was ready to throw more than 500,000 soldiers and officers and up to 4,000 tanks into battle. He even had an advantage in artillery, with up to 5,000 guns and mortars. But Iraq had fewer air and naval weapons, both in quantity and quality. For example, the Air Force had more than 700 aircraft. It may not seem like much, but the fleet looked very colorful. From the hopelessly outdated Il-28 to the middle-aged F-1 Mirage fighters and the latest MiG-29. On January 17, 1991, at 3 o'clock Baghdad time, the Allies launched Operation Desert Storm. The main goal was the liberation of Kuwait and the return of the legitimate government to power. In addition, it was supposed to restore stability in the region, change the political leadership of Iraq, destroy its military potential and make it impossible to produce weapons of mass destruction. The first strikes were carried out with Tomahawk sea-launched cruise missiles. This was followed by massive air raids involving 700 aircraft. This night was a stellar time for F-117 Nighthawks and their pilots. In general, this aircraft looked like an aerodynamic misunderstanding and had very mediocre flight characteristics. This was to make the strike vehicle invisible to air defense radars. In addition, Nighthawk aircraft painted with radio-absorbing black paint were impossible to see in the night sky. High-precision bombs were considered to be the main weapon of the unusual aircraft. All of this worked to perfection. Captain Robert Donaldson recalls, "The first bombs were dropped by a pair led by Major Fist on an Iraqi interceptor and tactical missile control center. Thanks to the precise coordination of our actions in the following minutes, most of the planned targets were taken by surprise and hit, including the 112-meter tower in the center of Baghdad, the key to the entire system of command and control of the armed forces. These strikes blinded the Iraqis, and they were unable to detect the attack of conventional aircraft that were approaching after us in time. Air defense was completely disorganized. We could see on the indicators in our cockpits how Iraqi MiG-29 aircraft were flying around us. But they were blind, they could not detect us. The Iraqis really couldn't organize a serious countermeasure to the raids. They put only 15 fighters in the air, which acted uncoordinated. They managed to shoot down only one aircraft. During the night, 18 Hornets from the Saratoga aircraft carrier encountered an Iraqi MiG-25 PD interceptor. In the battle, Lieutenant Commander Michael Spiker's plane was hit by a P-40 missile and crashed in the desert. The pilot was killed and became the first combat loss of the U.S. Armed Forces in that war. It was believed to have been shot down by an anti-aircraft missile. In 2001, a CIA report was published that described the battle with the MiG. At dawn, during the attack on the Sheba airfield, archaic ZSU-57-2 double-barreled anti-aircraft guns hit a British Tornado fighter bomber. The hits proved fatal to the plane, but the crew was able to successfully eject. These are, in fact, all the achievements of the Iraqis in their attempts to repel the first massive coalition attack. They could only rely on propaganda, which bravely lied about the destruction of 160 enemy aircraft. But there is evidence for only 2 of them. In total, on January 17, the Allies flew more than 1,300 sorties. The first stage of air and missile strikes lasted for 2 more days. Troop command posts, air defense control centers, 30 airfields, missile bases, 4 nuclear reactors, and chemical weapons production facilities were destroyed or severely damaged. The first estimates of American intelligence were too optimistic. For example, it was believed that 50% of Iraq's air force no longer existed, although in reality the figure was no more than 10%. Soon after, the head of the National Military Command Center, Thomas Kelly, admitted that some of the targets attacked were just mock-ups of Iraqi military facilities. The enemy began to move its most valuable aircraft to the airfields of its recent enemy, Iran. Saddam's military machine was damaged, but still combat-ready. The coalition continued air attacks for over a month. During that period, the aviation flew up to 800 sorties a day. Strikes were carried out both on enemy defense lines in Kuwait and on rear targets in Iraq. High-precision weapons were widely used. The media of the coalition countries repeatedly emphasized that this war would be the first in which no civilians would die. But the reality was far from these beautiful statements. The incident that occurred on February 13 received the greatest resonance. Then, the F-117 attacked a shelter in Baghdad's Emiria district with 2 laser-guided smart bombs in Baghdad. At least 408 civilians were killed. Later it turned out that it was not the pilots who made the mistake, but the intelligence. According to intelligence reports, this bomb shelter was converted into a command center or bunker for the military during the Iran-Iraq War. According to total post-war Iraqi data, the total number of civilian casualties reached almost 2,300 people. Hussein called the war the mother of all battles and promised to inflict a terrible massacre on American soldiers. But the coalition forces were in no hurry to engage in close combat. So, as an immediate response, the Iraqis decided to use the El Hussein and El Abbas ballistic missiles, which were a development of the Soviet P-17, better known by the NATO name Scud. They had extremely low accuracy, a deviation of up to 3 kilometers, but could deliver a 250 kilogram charge for almost 900 kilometers. First of all, they decided to attack Israel, which remained on the sidelines of the conflict. Saddam sought to provoke the Jews into joining the war, and thus break up the coalition, because the Arabs would not fight on the same side as them. On January 18, the first 8 rockets were fired toward Tel Aviv and Haifa. They did not reach their targets and fell near the cities, but there were still civilian casualties. The shelling lasted for almost 2 months, during which 88 rockets were fired at Israel, and according to other sources, 42. Many publications state that 74 people died as a result. At the same time, the Israeli authors insist that only 2 residents were directly affected by the explosions, while all the others died of heart attacks, improper use of gas masks, etc. Israel is not used to being weak. Inevitable retaliation has become a basic principle in relations with aggressive neighbors. Therefore, U.S. President George W. Bush had to use all his diplomatic skills to dissuade Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir from taking drastic steps. In addition, the United States sent the Patriot missile system to the Promised Land. Although they were not as effective against the Scuds as expected, they played their part. Israel did not enter the war. Iraq fired 47 more missiles at Saudi Arabia, and one of them caused disaster. On February 25, it hit the American barracks in Dhahran. 28 soldiers were killed and more than 100 were wounded. Thus, the missile attacks were by no means comparable to the massive Allied air raids. Iraqi generals had to come up with something else. And then an operation was developed to capture the coastal Saudi city of Khafji, and no one was interested in it in itself. The main goal was to inflict heavy losses on the coalition, especially on the Americans. Perhaps then they will think about whether it is worth continuing this war. On the morning of January 29, Iraqi tanks and infantry moved forward from Kuwaiti territory. Near Khafji, there were only Allied checkpoints with lightly armed fighters who could be quickly dealt with. But the Air Force intervened. The A-10 and gunship AC-130 with 105mm howitzers on board were particularly vicious. One Iraqi soldier noted that his brigade suffered more losses in 30 minutes near Khafji than in 8 years of war with Iran. It was only at night that the Iraqis entered the city, but they were able to hold it for just over a day. On February 1, the Saudi National Guard, with the support of Qatari forces, the U.S. Marine Corps and, of course, the Air Force, recaptured Khafji. The Iraqi operation failed. 32 people were killed by the Allies, including 11 Americans from friendly fire. According to various estimates, from 60 to 300 Iraqis were killed and more than 400 were captured. In February, the preparation of coalition forces for the ground phase of the operation entered its final stage. As early as November 1990, Schwarzkopf proposed a plan based on the new American doctrine of the air-to-ground campaign. The bet was on a broad maneuver of the troops. No one in the Pentagon was used to this, and no one supported Schwarzkopf. They considered it impossible to move 150,000 soldiers with tanks and artillery over hundreds of kilometers of deserted off-road terrain. Even many of the general's subordinates thought his plan was absurd. But Schwarzkopf found arguments to convince the skeptics, and the offensive went exactly according to his plan. The 7th Army and 18th Airborne Corps of the United States played an important role in the implementation of the plan. They were to move deep to the west, strike through Iraq, and surround the enemy in Kuwait with a wide coverage. For success, it was very important that the main Iraqi forces did not move to meet these corps, but remained in their positions in Kuwait. Therefore, the offensive was supposed to begin with a frontal attack on them. And this scenario worked brilliantly. On February 24, at 4:30 in the morning, a powerful fire training exercise involving artillery and aviation began. An hour later, the U.S. Marines, supported by tanks and in cooperation with Arab allies, launched an offensive on the coastal front. Their target was the capital city of Al-Kuwait. To the west, along the Saudi-Kuwaiti border, predominantly Arab contingents carried out a series of diversionary strikes. When the Iraqis got bogged down in these battles, the 7th and 18th Corps, along with French and British divisions, stepped in. Their strikes came as a complete surprise to the enemy. Meeting only minor resistance, the Allies began to advance rapidly through Iraq. In total, the coalition managed to defeat the enemy in 100 hours. On February 28, the war ended. Demoralized Iraqis surrendered en masse, the total number exceeding 60,000. One small unit surrendered to the machine for the first time in its history. The Iraqis were driven to despair by the bombardment from the battleship Wisconsin. And when the fire subsided, they saw a naval RQ-2, a Pioneer drone, arrive to assess the performance of the ship's guns. Not wanting to be hit by 16-inch shells again, the soldiers began to wave their white rags desperately. The drone operator understood their pantomime. Soon, U.S. Marines directly captured these Iraqis. In some areas, coalition forces encountered the Republican Guard. It was the best component of the Iraqi armed forces, and its personnel were famous for their loyalty to Saddam. However, the resistance of these fighters could hardly be called stubborn. Perhaps the most fierce was the tank battle for the so-called Medina Ridge that took place on February 27. In 2 hours, more than 300 American Abrams tanks, supported by air power, dealt with almost 200 tanks of the Medina Division. The Guards lost 186 tanks. The Americans had only 4 Abrams tanks damaged. Overall, the difference in losses between the sides is shocking. Thus, according to coalition estimates, their irreversible losses of personnel did not exceed 400 people, while at least 20,000 Iraqis were killed. The difference is 50 times. The Allies burned no more than 20 tanks, while Iraq burned at least 1,800. A difference of 90 times. And at the same time, the Allies noted that almost half of their losses were self-inflicted. In one incident, American A-10 attack aircraft mistakenly shot at 2 British armored personnel carriers, killing 9 soldiers. Of course, the statistics of that war still continue to cause debate among critical thinkers, because all these data come from the victorious relational statements of the coalition, primarily the Americans. The Iraqi data has not yet been published, and it is not known whether it has been preserved at all. Therefore, the issue remains unresolved, although by and large, this is not of fundamental importance. No one doubts the unconditional victory of the Allies. During the retreat from Kuwait, the Iraqi army set fire to oil wells and specially dug trenches. The oil that did not burn out began to flow into the Persian Gulf. According to the BBC, it was one of the largest environmental disasters in history. After the war, black rains fell in Kuwait, Turkey, and the United Arab Emirates. Elimination of fires and other consequences of this barbarism lasted for many months. In his memoirs, General Schwarzkopf noted, "Saddam's armed forces have been crushingly defeated and no longer pose a threat to any nation." Since he accomplished the unthinkable, attacking his fellow Arabs and subsequently losing face in a humiliating military defeat, Saddam's bellicose voice is no longer relevant in Arab politics. These lines were written in 1992. The generals somewhat exaggerated the impact of the desert defeat on Hussein. Having liberated Kuwait, the Allies did not accomplish everything they had planned. Saddam's regime survived, and even more, he had an excuse to avoid the accusations of his own people about his further impoverishment. They say that the coalition is to blame for everything, especially the damned Western imperialists. Baghdad has retained some influence in the Arab world, and the ability to produce chemical weapons, and its aggressive intentions have not disappeared. In the end, in 2003, the United States had to organize a new campaign against the odious Saddam, which we will tell you about in detail if this video gets 20,000 likes in a month. Dear friends, please support the armed forces of Ukraine. Don't forget to subscribe to our History Without Myths channel. Click the bell and comment on this video episode. Thank you for watching. Glory to Ukraine.